The wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of death. Samuel McCready pulled his heavy coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped onto the porch of his ranch house, the wooden boards creaking under his boots despite the bitter cold that had settled into every joint and nail. The storm had been building for days, and now it unleashed its fury with a vengeance that reminded him why so many called this land God-forsaken. At 62 years old, Samuel had weathered more storms than he cared to count, both from nature and from life itself. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of ranch work, gripped the porch railing as he surveyed his land. The cattle had been moved to the sheltered valleys weeks ago, and his few remaining ranch hands had taken refuge in the bunkhouse. Everything that could be secured had been secured. All that remained was to wait out the storm and pray it wouldn't last long enough to kill his livestock. The ranch had been his life for 37 years. Ever since he'd claimed this piece of wilderness and carved a home from nothing but determination and sweat. His wife Martha had stood beside him through those early years, when wolves threatened the cattle and drought threatened their dreams. She'd borne him 2 sons who'd grown strong and proud on this land, learning to rope and ride before they could properly walk. But Martha was 10 years in the ground now, taken by a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could touch. His boys had moved on to lives of their own, one to California's gold fields and another to the growing cities back east where opportunities promised easier living than the harsh frontier could provide. Now Samuel lived alone with his memories and his stubborn refusal to abandon the land that had taken so much from him, yet remained the only home he'd ever truly known. The isolation had become a companion of sorts, familiar and sometimes welcome. He'd grown accustomed to the silence broken only by wind and cattle, to conversations held with horses who listened without judgment, to evenings spent reading by lamplight with only the crackling fire for company. But tonight, as the storm raged with unprecedented fury, even his acceptance of solitude felt fragile against the raw power of nature's assault. The temperature had dropped so fast that ice formed on the windows within hours, and the wind drove snow horizontally across the prairie in sheets, so thick he couldn't see his own barn 50 yards away. This was the kind of storm that killed travelers caught in the open, that buried entire homesteads until spring revealed their tragic remains. Samuel was preparing to retreat inside when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost convinced himself it was merely the wind playing tricks. But there it was again, a thin cry that carried something human in its desperation. He squinted into the swirling white chaos, trying to distinguish shapes from shadows, reality from the hallucinations that extreme cold could conjure in tired minds. Then he saw her. A small figure struggled through the snow, barely visible against the white fury of the storm. At first he thought his eyes deceived him, but as the shape drew closer, stumbling and falling and rising again with determination that defied her size, Samuel realized with horror that a child was out there in conditions that would kill a grown man. Without hesitation, he plunged from the porch into the storm, the cold hitting him like a physical blow that stole his breath and made his bones ache instantly. The wind threatened to knock him down with every step, and the snow stung his exposed face like needles of ice. He pushed forward, calling out though he doubted his voice could carry over the storm's roar, following the dark speck that moved with agonizing slowness toward his house. When he reached her, Samuel found a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, though the cold and exhaustion made it difficult to tell. Her lips were blue, her small hands red and swollen from the cold despite thin mittens that offered little protection. She wore a coat too big for her frame, probably handed down from an older sibling, and boots that had seen better days. Ice had formed in her hair and on her eyelashes, and she shook so violently he feared she might collapse. But her eyes burned with a fierce determination that reminded him of Martha in her strongest moments. Even as her body betrayed her to the cold, those eyes held purpose and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible over the wind. "My mama will die in the cold." Samuel didn't hesitate. He swept the child into his arms, shocked by how light she felt. How fragile and burred, like her bones seemed through the inadequate clothing. She clung to him with strength that surprised him, and he felt her whole body shuddering against his chest as he carried her toward the house. The warmth inside hit them both like a wall, and Samuel kicked the door shut behind them, cutting off the wind's howl to a muffled roar. He set the girl down gently in front of the fireplace, where flames danced and crackled with welcoming heat. Her eyes, wide and dark and a face pale with cold, never left his as he knelt beside her. "What's your name, child?" he asked gently, his voice rusty from Dessous but carrying all the warmth he could muster. "Lucy," she said, still shivering violently. "Lucy May Hartwell. We was travelin' to my uncle's place in Billings, but our wagon broke and Papa went to find help. That was 2 days ago. Mama's real sick with fever, and the baby won't stop crying, and I couldn't get the fire to start right." Samuel felt his heart clench at the matter of fact way she recited their tragedy. 2 days in this storm meant her father was likely dead, frozen somewhere out there in the white wasteland. A sick mother and a crying baby meant time was running out for whatever family this brave little girl had left. "Where is your mama now?" he asked, already reaching for his heaviest coat and boots. "About a mile back that way." Lucy pointed toward the southwest, the direction from which the storm's fury seemed strongest. "In a little shelter Papa made with the wagon canvas. But it ain't keeping the cold out good, and Mama's getting sicker, and little Thomas keeps crying for milk but Mama don't have none to give him." Samuel's mind raced. A mile in this storm might as well be 10, and carrying a sick woman and baby back through conditions that had nearly killed a healthy child seemed impossible. But leaving them out there meant certain death, and looking into Lucy's trusting eyes, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. "Lucy, I need you to stay here and get warm," he said firmly. "There's soup on the stove and blankets by the fire. I'm going to get your mama and the baby." "I'll come with you," she said immediately, struggling to stand on legs that still shook from cold and exhaustion. "I know right where they are." "No, child. You've done enough brave things for one day. Your job now is to get warm and strong so you can help me take care of your mama when I bring her back." Lucy's face crumpled, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked like the frightened child she truly was. "What if you can't find them? What if you get lost too?" Samuel knelt and took her small hands in his large, calloused ones. "I won't get lost. I've lived on this land for more years than you've been alive, and I know every inch of it even in the dark. I promise you, I'll bring them back." Something in his voice, perhaps the certainty born of decades facing down nature's challenges, seemed to convince her. She nodded slowly, though tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. Samuel quickly gathered what he needed: rope to keep him tethered to landmarks, a lantern though it would do little good in the storm, blankets and his emergency medical supplies. He hitched his strongest horses to the sleigh, knowing wheels would be useless in the deep snow. The animals snorted and stamped, reluctant to leave the warmth of the barn, but they trusted him as he trusted them. Before leaving, he made sure Lucy had everything she needed. He showed her where the soup was warming, how to add wood to the fire, where to find more blankets if she needed them. She listened with the serious attention of a child forced to grow up too quickly, nodding at each instruction. "I'll be back," he promised again, and headed into the storm. The journey that should have taken 20 minutes stretched into an hour of fighting through snow that reached his horses' bellies and wind that threatened to overturn the sleigh. Samuel navigated by instinct and memory, recognizing the shape of a dead tree here, the slope of a familiar hill there, landmarks that remained constant even when the world turned white and wild. When he finally found them, his heart nearly broke. The makeshift shelter was little more than canvas stretched between the broken wagon and a few scraggly trees, held down by rocks and hope. Inside, huddled together for warmth that wasn't enough, he found a woman barely conscious with fever and a baby, whose cries had weakened to pitiful whimpers. Elizabeth Hartwell couldn't have been more than 30, but illness and hardship had carved lines around her eyes and drawn the color from her cheeks. She held her infant son with arms that trembled from more than cold, and when Samuel's lantern light fell across her face, she looked up with the same fierce determination he'd seen in Lucy's eyes. Are you real?" she whispered. "Real as the storm," Samuel replied, already working to wrap her and the baby in the blankets he'd brought. "Your daughter found me. Lucy's safe and warm at my house." Elizabeth closed her eyes, and tears of relief ran down her cheeks. "She's so brave, too brave for her age. I told her not to go, but she said she wouldn't let us die." "She was right to come," Samuel said gently, lifting the baby from her arms. The child was frighteningly quiet, and Samuel could feel how cold the little body had become. "Can you travel? We need to get you both warm." "I don't think I can walk," Elizabeth admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You don't need to walk. Just hold on," Samuel carried the baby to the sleigh first, wrapping him in furs and placing him in the most sheltered spot. Then he returned for Elizabeth, lifting her as carefully as he could. She weighed almost nothing, her body burning with fever yet shaking with cold in the way that meant hypothermia was setting in. The journey back tested every skill Samuel had learned in 4 decades of frontier life. The horses struggled against the wind and snow, and several times he had to get out and lead them when the drifts grew too deep. Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness, and the baby's silence worried him more than crying would have. But Lucy had kept the fire burning bright, and when Samuel finally pushed through the door carrying her mother, the little girl's face transformed with joy and relief that made all the struggle worthwhile. Over the following days, as the storm continued its assault on the land, Samuel's house became a sanctuary for the small broken family. Elizabeth's fever broke on the 2nd day, helped by the warmth and the herbal remedies Martha had taught him years before. The baby, young Thomas, began to cry with healthy vigor once he was warm and his mother was well enough to nurse him properly. Lucy appointed herself Samuel's helper in all things, following him as he cared for the animals, helped with her mother's recovery, and kept the household running. She asked endless questions about the ranch, about the cattle and horses, about how he'd learned to read the weather and survive in such harsh conditions. "Did you always live alone?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her mother sleeping peacefully with the baby in her arms. "No," Samuel said, whittling a small toy horse he'd decided to make for Thomas. "I had a wife once and 2 sons. They're all gone now, one way or another. Don't you get lonesome?" Samuel considered the question seriously, as he'd learned to do with Lucy's innocent but profound inquiries. "Sometimes, but I've got the land and the animals and work that needs doing. A man can find purpose in taking care of things, even if he's alone. Mama says Papa went to find help, but he ain't come back." The simple statement carried the weight of understanding that her father was likely dead, though neither of them spoke it aloud. Samuel had found no trace of him during his searches when the weather allowed, and 3 days in that storm would have claimed even the strongest man. "Your papa was brave to try," Samuel said quietly. "He loved you all enough to risk everything." Lucy nodded solemnly, then brightened. "You were brave too. You came out in the storm for us." "That wasn't brave," Samuel replied. "That was just what needed doing." But as the days passed and the storm finally exhausted itself, Samuel began to realize that what had started as simple human decency was becoming something deeper. Lucy's laughter filled corners of the house that had been silent for years. Elizabeth's grateful presence reminded him of conversations over evening meals and the comfort of shared companionship. Even baby Thomas, with his innocent demands and trusting sleep, brought life to rooms that had known only solitude. When the weather cleared enough for travel, Samuel knew he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Elizabeth was well enough to continue their journey to her brother, in Law's place in Billings, where she and the children would presumably find the support of family and the promise of a new start. It was what she'd been traveling toward when disaster struck, and Samuel had no right to interfere with those plans. But as he watched Lucy teaching the horses to eat carrots from her small hands, and listened to Elizabeth humming lullabies that brought music back to his home, Samuel found himself hoping they might choose to stay. The conversation came naturally one morning as they shared breakfast, the kind of simple domestic scene Samuel had forgotten he missed. "The weather's clearing," he observed, looking out at blue sky visible for the first time in over a week. Elizabeth nodded, her expression growing serious. "We should be able to travel soon. I hate to impose on your kindness any longer." "It's no imposition," Samuel said quickly, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "Elizabeth, I need to say something, and I hope you won't take offense. I know you plan to go to your husband's brother in Billings, but I'd like you to consider staying here." Lucy looked up from feeding Thomas small spoonfuls of porridge, her eyes bright with hope. "This ranch is more than one man can properly tend," Samuel continued. "I'm not getting any younger and I could use help. Lucy's already proven she's got the makings of a fine ranch hand, and you'd bring something to this place that's been missing too long." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel feared he'd overstepped, presumed too much on their shared ordeal. "Samuel," she said finally, "I have nothing to offer but 3 mouths to feed and work-worn hands. My husband left us with debts and dreams that died with him. I can't even promise the children won't be more burden than help. You'd offer exactly what this place needs." Samuel replied with conviction. Children's voices, a woman's touch, a family's warmth. I've got enough land and resources to support us all, and more company than I've had in years. If you're willing to share the work and the hardships, I'd be honored to share everything else. Lucy could contain herself no longer. Mama, can we stay? Please, I like it here, and Mr. Samuel needs us, and the horses like me and. Lucy, Elizabeth said gently, but she was smiling. What about your Uncle Henry in Billings? I don't even know Uncle Henry, Lucy said practically. But I know Mr. Samuel saved us, and he makes the best pancakes I ever ate. And he promised to teach me to rope cattle when I'm bigger. Samuel looked at Elizabeth, seeing her wrestle with a decision that would shape all their futures. He understood her hesitation. Accepting his offer meant abandoning her original plans, trusting a man she'd known only days, building a new life from the ashes of the old. I won't lie to you, he said honestly. Ranch life is hard, especially for women and children. The winters are brutal, supplies run short, and there's always work that needs doing. But there's beauty here too, and freedom, and room for children to grow strong and independent. Most importantly, you'd never have to face hardship alone again. Elizabeth looked around the house that had sheltered them through the storm, at Lucy's hopeful face, at Samuel's weathered hands that had gentled horses and tended sick babies with equal skill. When she spoke, her voice carried the same determination that had driven Lucy through the blizzard. We'll stay, she said simply. If you're sure you want us. Samuel felt something unlock in his chest that had been closed for 10 years. I'm sure. The months that followed brought challenges Samuel had forgotten existed alongside joys he'd never expected to experience again. Lucy threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm that sometimes worried her mother and always impressed Samuel. She learned to milk the gentler cows, to gather eggs without frightening the chickens, to recognize the signs of weather change and animal illness. Her endless questions and boundless energy reminded him daily why children were blessings, even when they complicated everything. Elizabeth proved herself invaluable in ways both practical and profound. Her cooking transformed meals from mere fuel into occasions for conversation and connection. Her skill with needle and thread repaired everything from torn clothing to damaged harnesses. Her gentle presence turned the house from a shelter into a home, complete with curtains on the windows and flowers planted around the porch, despite the harsh climate. Baby Thomas grew from a sickly infant into a robust toddler who followed Lucy everywhere and viewed Samuel as the most fascinating person in his expanding world. His first word was horse, spoken while pointing at Samuel's favorite mare, and his delighted laughter became the soundtrack to their daily routines. But perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth brought back to Samuel's life something he'd forgotten he needed: partnership. Not the romantic love he'd shared with Martha, which remained a precious memory, but the deep friendship and mutual respect that grew from shared work and common purpose. They consulted on decisions about the ranch, divided responsibilities according to their strengths, and found comfort in companionship that asked nothing more than presence and understanding. The transformation wasn't without difficulties. Lucy suffered nightmares about the storm and her father's disappearance that left her crying in the dark until Samuel or her mother could comfort her back to sleep. Elizabeth sometimes grew quiet and distant, lost in grief for the husband who died trying to save them and the life they'd planned together. Samuel occasionally found himself overwhelmed by the constant presence of others after years of solitude, retreating to the barn or the far pastures when he needed space to think. But they learned to navigate these challenges together, developing the rhythms and accommodations that families create over time. Lucy's nightmares faded as security replaced fear. Elizabeth's grief softened from sharp pain to gentle sadness as new hopes took root alongside old memories. Samuel discovered that solitude shared by choice felt different from loneliness endured by circumstance. The first year tested them all. A late spring storm killed several calves and damaged part of the barn roof. A dry summer stressed the water sources and required careful rationing. An early winter caught them with insufficient hay stores and forced difficult decisions about which animals to keep and which to sell. But they met each challenge together, their combined efforts and perspectives proving stronger than any individual could have managed alone. Lucy's sharp eyes spotted problems before they became disasters. Elizabeth's practical wisdom prevented waste and found solutions Samuel's bachelor habits had overlooked. Samuel's experience and resources provided the foundation that allowed them all to thrive. By the second spring, Visitors to the ranch commented on the transformation. The house showed a woman's care in its cleanliness and comfort. The gardens bloomed with vegetables and flowers that added color and abundance to their table. The children's presence brought energy and purpose that impressed even the most hardened cowboys who worked the seasonal cattle drives. "You've done well for yourself," McCready observed Tom Bradley, a neighboring rancher who'd known Samuel for 20 years. "Family suits you better than I expected." Samuel, watching Lucy demonstrate her roping skills to an audience of impressed ranch hands while Elizabeth tended Thomas on the porch, had to agree. "Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as disasters," he replied. But the true test of their bond came during their third winter together, when Samuel collapsed while tending cattle in a sudden blizzard. Lucy found him unconscious in the snow, his horse standing guard against the wind. Elizabeth and Lucy together managed to get him back to the house, where Elizabeth nursed him through a fever that lasted nearly a week. During his illness, Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for Martha, sometimes for his long-lost sons. But through it all, he was aware of Elizabeth's gentle care and Lucy's worried presence. When Thomas climbed onto the bed to pat his face with small, concerned hands, Samuel realized with crystal clarity that these people were no longer guests in his house. They were his family in every way that mattered. When he recovered, Samuel made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He called for the territorial judge and formally adopted Lucy and Thomas, giving them his name and legal claim to the ranch. He also asked Elizabeth to marry him, not from romantic passion but from deep affection and practical partnership that had proven stronger than either had expected. "I know it's not the love story you might have dreamed of," he told her as they sat by the fire after the children were asleep. "But I can offer you security, companionship, and a father for your children who'll love them as his own." Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, watching the flames dance in the fireplace where Samuel had first brought her children back to warmth and safety. When she spoke, her voice carried the same practical wisdom that had sustained them through 3 years of challenges. "Samuel, I learned something during those days in the storm when I thought we might all die. Love isn't just the passion of youth. It's also the choice to stand together when everything tries to tear you apart. You've already shown me that kind of love, and I'd be proud to call you husband." They married in the spring, with Lucy as Elizabeth's maid of honor and Thomas as the ring bearer, who nearly lost the bands in the church aisle but recovered them with determined persistence that made everyone laugh. The ceremony was simple, attended by neighboring ranchers and their families who'd watched the unusual household develop with interest and approval. Samuel was 68 when he spoke his vows, Elizabeth 35, Lucy 12, and Thomas 3. By any conventional measure, they were an improbable family, thrown together by tragedy, bound by necessity, sustained by choice. But as they stood together, promising to face whatever came with united strength, Samuel knew he'd found something precious in his twilight years that many people never discovered in lifetimes of searching. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Lucy grew into a confident young woman who could ride and rope as well as any cowboy, yet who also possessed her mother's gentle wisdom and practical skills. Thomas developed into a sturdy boy who treated Samuel as the only father he'd ever known and learned the land with instinctive understanding that impressed veteran ranchers. Elizabeth bloomed in the security and partnership Samuel provided. Her natural beauty enhanced by contentment and the kind of deep happiness that comes from purposeful work and unconditional acceptance. She bore Samuel a daughter in their second year of marriage, a blue-eyed baby they named Martha Hope, who grew up knowing nothing but love and belonging. Samuel lived to see Lucy marry a young rancher from the neighboring valley, a good man who understood and appreciated the strength and independence her upbringing had fostered. He watched Thomas graduate from the Territorial College and return to expand the ranch operations with modern techniques and machinery. He held his granddaughter Martha Hope's first child, marveling at the continuation of life and love that had grown from that night when a desperate little girl knocked on his door. When Samuel died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, he was surrounded by the family he'd chosen and who had chosen him in return. His funeral filled the church with ranchers, townspeople, and neighbors who remembered not just his success with cattle and land, but his willingness to open his door and his heart to those who needed shelter from life's storms. Elizabeth lived on the ranch until her own death 20 years later, watching over the land and the family that had grown from Samuel's simple act of human kindness. Lucy and Thomas inherited not just property and livestock, but values and traditions that they passed on to their own children and grandchildren. The original ranch house still stands today, now the heart of an operation that spans several states and supports dozens of families. Visitors often remark on the warmth that seems to permeate the old structure, the sense of welcome that makes strangers feel like family. Those who know the history understand that some places hold the memory of love within their walls, and some acts of compassion echo through generations. In the small cemetery on the hill behind the house, 4 headstones stand together under an ancient oak tree that Samuel planted the year after he married Elizabeth. The inscriptions are simple: names, dates, and a single line that tells their story better than volumes could. They opened their hearts to strangers and found family. On winter nights, when the wind howls across the Montana plains with the same fury that once brought them together, local people sometimes tell the story of Samuel McCready and the family he chose when a little girl knocked on his door with desperate words and trusting eyes. They speak of how the hardest storms sometimes carry the greatest blessings, and how the courage to help others in their darkest moments can transform not just their lives, but our own. The story reminds listeners that family isn't always about blood relations or conventional arrangements. Sometimes it's about recognizing need and responding with generosity, about choosing love over fear, about understanding that our greatest strength comes not from what we can accumulate for ourselves, but from what we're willing to share with others. And sometimes, when the snow falls heavy and the wind cuts sharp, people swear they can still hear the echo of a small voice carrying across the years, "My mama will die in the cold." They remember how one man's open door became the foundation for generations of love, and they're reminded that every act of kindness has the power to change the world, one heart at a time.